So I'm going to take you beyond the TPP. I want to go beyond the current political debate. And just when you look out at the global economy right now, what do you see? And in particular, what do you see in terms of the nature or the shape of globalization out there? A lot of us have spent a lot of time thinking about the slowdown in global trade that we've seen in the last few years, for example, trying to figure out what that means. Is that something cyclical? Is it structural? Is that something we need to think about in terms of technology, in terms of liberalization, protectionism, and so on? So I'm just curious, when you're sitting in at the White House, and you're looking out, what do you see?
I think the only honest answer to that question is all of the above, right? Is that there are certainly cyclical forces. I think the U.S. government has been pretty persistent since about late 2008, early 2009, of saying we don't think the world is growing fast enough, and we think there are a lot of policy-induced reasons for that. I think we've actually gotten more consensus in places like the G7 and G20 over the last year and a half or so, where you see more statements saying, yes, we will use all policy tools to try to increase growth. We will take, basically saying we will quit choking off growth with our fiscal policy where we can. You've seen places like the IMF and the OECD take very, very different policy prescriptions than they did 5 years ago. And so I think that's helpful. And I think if we can increase the baseline level of growth, I think trade is part and parcel of what's going on with growth. But you also see trade slow down even relative to the GDP slowdown. And so I think there are some structural issues. I think, just frankly, there was a massive shift of breaking up the supply chain and breaking up global value chains, in part because China was a very attractive destination, in part because new technologies, new information technologies, and management technologies made it easier to think about breaking up those supply chains, and we did a lot of that. And I'm not saying we've hit the outer limit of how far that can go, but it's not clear that you're going to be growing trade that much faster than GDP growth forever at that pace. Eventually, everything will be traded, and I think we know not everything is going to be a traded good or service. And so I think there is, in some sense, some natural limits on how much faster trade can grow than GDP, and so I think some of it may be coming from there as well. So I think in a lot of ways, there's a cyclical piece we can address as policymakers. There's a structural part that we can, and then I think last there is this concern, and this is where I do come back to things like TPP. One of the reasons trade grows faster than output is if you keep opening market access. And if instead you stop increasing market access and governments, as they are wont to do, continually try to nibble back to kind of resist some market access, then what you wind up with is trade growing slower than it could have been otherwise growing.
Right, so the end of liberalization, or the end of an era of liberalization. I mean, are we there? Are we at the end of an era, the advent of a new era, or is it just a kind of we're back to normal?
I don't know that we are at the end of an era. I mean, I would just say, as I said, if TPP doesn't happen, something will happen in Asia. There will be some sort of trade agreement in Asia, whether the U.S. wants to participate and set the rules of the road or not. And so you're going to see increased trade in Asia coming out of some sort of trading agreement that gets negotiated there. There may be, so there's obviously lots of things going on in Europe, within Europe right now, but there's also been quite a long discussion around issues like TTIP that I think you will continue to see improved steps taken to make sure, whether it's regulatory harmonization or outright trade deals, that something will happen to make it easier for firms to engage in global trade. And so I think it's not that we're at an end of an era of liberalization as much as it's always hard, and it's always been hard, and we will continue to make kind of halting steps forward and then pause.
So where do you do this? When you're advising the next president, you're leaving a kind of memo in your top drawer for the person who replaces you. Do you talk about doing this in multilateral venues, or do you talk about pursuing the strategy of regional agreements? I mean, that was TPP, TTIP, all of that was born out of frustration with the multilateral system. And the Doha round, and it going nowhere.
Yeah.
So where do you?
I don't think you can give up on multilateral agreements, and I think you pursue regional agreements where they make sense, and you pursue multilateral to whatever extent you can get deals done. And there have been deals that have been done on a variety of issues, whether it's doing an environmental goods agreement across a wider set of countries, to attack one particular issue, and then doing a services agreement over whoever wants to play there. And so it may be an overlapping patchwork. It may not always be one big everyone at once, but there's no reason to stop trying that. I mean, there's, you should always try to engage in those things. And for no other reason than you might then come to agreements, at least with enough people, that could make smaller agreements.
I think it pulls one of the striking things is when you look into the crosstabs on these, when you start looking through the generations, incredible support among younger people for trade and globalization and so on. Is this kind of political moments, political resistance, just a kind of something that we needed to get through, a kind of generational transition, and then when we get on to the young people, those oh-so-hopeful millennials, the world will be all that much better, and we will live in a new globalist, to use the term.
So I guess I would say this, and I'm not saying, I'm going to caricature your argument for a second, and so I'm not saying you're making this, but I don't think waiting for a bunch of people to die is a strategy. Right? I don't think that's the way you want to view the people that you are in charge of making policy for. And I think it is why I'm really not underplaying the extent that I think that policymakers broadly have dropped the ball on making sure that dislocations that are going to happen, whether it's technology or trade, and they often get completely confounded in people's heads because you don't vote on technology, but you vote on trade. But that we haven't done enough to try to make sure people look at these things as opportunities and not threats. Right. And I think we need to do better there. I think things like free community college for all was an important proposal that would have made a lot of sense, that would have made some people, not everybody, but some of the people who were finding that the career path they thought they were on may not exist, could in an easier way say, all right, this is the time to pivot. You could have done wage insurance, which we keep proposing, where you make it easier for people to switch to a different job without taking a big hit to living standards, so you don't lose them out of the labor force. Right? You just get them back in for a while. Maybe they find the perfect job, maybe they don't, but they don't get lost from the labor force. And so I think there are things we can do that make it seem like less of a threat to people. There's obviously a generational split. I think people have different views on the type of career they were anticipating, and a global economy is more of a threat to some people than others. But I think there still are people who look at it and say, this is scary, I'm not sure I like this. And I think you need to try to do whatever you can to make sure that it's an opportunity and not a threat.
So in all of the political discourse out there, and this comes out of the White House as well as the campaign trail, is a huge focus on manufacturing jobs, which have become a sort of declining portion of the U.S. labor force and the U.S. economy over the last 30 years. Why the obsession with manufacturing, and how do you get the conversation to move beyond that?
So I think I think there is, for many people, always going to be something visceral about making things, and so they want to think about that.
That's for good TV.
Yeah. At the same time, I don't think it's just that. I think there is something important that comes out of manufacturing. I think, and I think there's a difference between obsessing over it in a way that you ignore other aspects of the economy and trying to take steps that make sure you're not ignoring that part of the economy. I think if you look, from 2000 to 2009, the U.S., I mean, first of all, I think always one important thing is when you look at employment, it's misleading because productivity is very high in manufacturing, and so you can have, U.S. manufacturing output as high as it's ever been, and just you don't need as many people. It doesn't mean we're no longer making things here. We're still the third largest exporter of manufactured goods in the world, right? I do get frustrated sometimes when I hear people say, well, the U.S. can't make anything anymore. It's not competitive. I think, well, then how are we the third largest exporter? I mean, it's not just that we're selling to ourselves. We're selling to the rest of the world. And so I think, but when you look, you see there was a stretch of time where the U.S. lost a lot of market share in manufactured exports. But that has actually flattened out over the last 8 years. And I think you can take steps in terms of policy to try to make sure, whether it's the advanced manufacturing institutes or all sorts of things, which is not to say you're going to obsess and say this is the only thing that matters, but you're going to say that you're going to try to make sure that whatever manufacturing activity makes sense to locate here, and whatever jobs should be here for that you're going to do the things that are needed to make sure that can happen. If for no other reason than a lot of the innovative activity, it's useful for it to be co-located. I think there are studies that suggest that. And so you don't want to completely lose your manufacturing base, because then you start to lose some of the innovation base and some of the R&D jobs that go with it. And so I think that's one of the reasons people do worry a bit, is they say we don't want to lose all of this, because we have other jobs that are ancillary that are important, and it's helpful if they're co-located.
But when you're thinking ahead over the next half century, and you're thinking about the U.S. economy and its relationship with the outside world, is the future of trade in the U.S. economy and manufacturing, or is it another sector?
I mean, I think if for no other reason than so much trade in manufacturing goods has taken place and has been liberalized, that services are clearly a place. And, agriculture has been bound by many trade restrictions in a lot of countries on the one hand, and services is just a new idea to a lot of people to allow some participation across countries. And so I think, the U.S. is this huge services exporter, has a big services surplus in terms of its exports versus its imports and services. It'll continue to see a lot of growth in that area. So that's the thing. I think saying that manufacturing is important is, to me, not saying you focus on it exclusively. And I know sometimes you can hear people talk about it in a way that sounds like it's the only thing that matters. I think, business services are incredibly important to the U.S. economy, innovation activity. Education is a huge sector of the U.S. economy, and frankly, a big exporter when you think of the education that happens here versus in other countries. So I think there's a lot of places where you'd want to be focused broadly, and I think, yes, over time you'll see services take a bigger role in trade just because it's a bigger role in the economy.
Do you think, I write for an audience that is largely outside the U.S., and they look at the current debate, and they think they're seeing the beginning of the U.S. Withdrawing from the international, or its old responsibilities, or its old leadership role in the international community. How worried are you about that?
I think you have to be worried. I think at the same time, there have always been controversies about any trade agreement, about trade. There have, Japan was a huge threat. Mexico was. There have been always these cyclical, huge threats to our, that are existential threats to the economy that the U.S. Very much pushed back against. I mean, by the same token, for all the humming and grinding in the election, this administration has, arguably been the least protectionist you've seen, right? We have not done, big tariffs on steel. We have not done voluntary export restraints on autos with Japan. We haven't done those big examples, and we've continued to try to push liberalization. And so it's possible that new leadership would come in with different views, but I think it's also possible that over time the system is built to try to make sure that the U.S. maintains an important leadership role in the world, and part of that is through trade.
We should probably turn to the floor here. Grab a microphone.
I think we have a mic. If the mic might take a second. Ethan's got one over there. Again, as Sean said, please identify yourself, what group you're with, and we play by Jeopardy rules here, so please ask your question in the form of a question. Thanks.
All these smart people with no questions. This is like this must be like the 8 a.m. class
Yes.
at GW in economics. How do you look at China nowadays, and how do you view the slowdown in China, and how is that going to change the shape of globalization or the U.S. relationship with China?
So, China is trying to do something that's never been done in a sense, which is transition from an export-led and investment-led economy to a consumption-led economy without slowing down dramatically. On the other hand, it's trying to do it arguably at a lower level of GDP per capita than a lot of other countries have tried to do it, so it would make sense for them to continue growing quickly. There's that one hand where you say, no one's ever pulled this off. On the other hand, if you were to describe to someone 35 years ago what China was going to do in the economic sphere over the last 35 years, they would have thought you were insane. So I think in that sense, I'm always careful to say what China wants to do has never been done, and therefore it can't be done.
Right.
By the same token, I think there are clear concerns in the sense that China, I think the policymakers understand the issue, and they say the right things about the issue, that they need to transition to a more consumption-led economy. I think one of the clear reasons for that is, if you just play around with the spreadsheet briefly, if you have an economy that is very, very large, that is growing faster than the rest of the world, it can't be export-led. right? Because eventually it literally is the entire export market. We've actually done the math on this, and we're quite confident that eventually all exports come from a country if it's that large and tries to grow that much faster than the rest of the
How long
world.
does it take you to get there?
It depends on what assumptions you use, but you can get there. And so I think the point is, though, that there was a point, even going back before the crisis, that U.S. imports from China were growing very quickly as a share of the U.S. economy. Exports from China to the U.S. had already been slowing down as a share of China's economy. Right? It's just a game of denominator, right? And so there was no way they could be forever led by imports from a slower growing portion of the world. And so they understand that. You can have conversations with the policymakers, they get that. But pulling the switch to say, oh, growth is slowing down, what do? It's very hard to say, well, we're going to use this lever we've never used, which is consumption-oriented fiscal stimulus. And they've said it, and they understand it, and I think they're continuing to try to push in that direction, but that's going to be a challenge. And I think in terms of the global economy, it's really, really important that takes place and that they get there. Just kind of pushing the lever of more investment in infrastructure has its limits, and it turns into an inefficient way to run our economy.
You've literally written the book on exchange rate policy. How do you look at China nowadays and its shift in exchange rate policy? And also, what has happened more recently in terms of the value of the renminbi and how it's fallen?
So what I would say is the shift in policy 14 months ago or so, I think it's safe to say, was not received by markets well. It was viewed as a little uncertain. It wasn't clear what they were doing. It wasn't clear what they meant. And I think we went through a period of about 6 months or so where there were periodically great fears of, is China trying to engineer a big devaluation, and should I get my money out? And there were a lot of capital outflows. I do think one of the things that was really important was when you started to get very senior Chinese leadership saying, we understand that devaluation is not the way to increase growth. We understand. Now, what the RMB has depreciated some since then on a trade-weighted basis, but I think they've tried to take off the table the notion that when faced with a growth slowdown, they're just going to engineer a big drop in the currency to try to export more. And they've tried to make clear that that's not the way this is going to play out. And I think that's really important because I think, again, it's not a viable long-run strategy, and it's frankly not really a viable short-run strategy. Because if you look back to previous August, when they depreciated, a lot of Asia went with them. They actually moved a lot more against the dollar than on a trade-weighted basis. It didn't actually help them that much. And I think that was informative to them, that they're one of the biggest currencies, one of the biggest economies. Some of the levers you could have used 25 years ago don't really work yet.
One of the big controversies around, oh my God, all these questions now all of a sudden. So why don't we start on the left here? Great. I had a really good question.
Bonnie and Trade Policy, Library of Congress. What approach do you suggest with regards to negotiations at the WTO? Start over or continue?
Why don't we go to that right away?
So I guess one thing I'd just say is, this is where I try to sometimes remember my lane as an economist and not a negotiator. And I talk to our negotiating team, and I can say, I think there's always the temptation to say, let's just scrap everything and start fresh. But I think there's a lot of built up capital between negotiators along certain lines, and I think just saying we're going to start with a fresh slate has some disadvantages in terms of just timing. So I think I think that's more a negotiating strategy question that I don't feel entirely qualified to answer. But my gut is that just a blank slate isn't necessarily going to be that helpful because there's a lot there.
But the way things are shifting in the WTO seems to be a whole procession of smaller agreements or negotiations, picking apart the dough around and moving away from this idea of the single undertaking, the behemoth, to kind of smaller agreements. Do you think that makes sense?
I think making progress where you can make sense, right? And I think if you think you just don't have a deal in front of you that you can get a broad deal on, then you make progress where you can, and you continue trying to negotiate a broader deal. And again, if pieces of it break off because they're viable, then you take what you can get.
There's some questions. There we go. We've got two gentlemen next to each other right there. We'll start on the right because we were on the left first.
I'm Dan Pearson from the Cato Institute. this question has to do with anti-dumping countervailing duties. The steel industry has sought and obtained now in excess of 160 anti-dumping duty orders on a wide variety of products. It's entirely possible that the effective level of import protection for steel is now higher than at any time since FDR was on mining exclude hauling. Not sure. At some point, we got the level of effective steel import protection down quite low, and now it's a practical matter. It's coming up again. My concern is that steel is an import in so many other industries. You've got about $60 billion of value added to the U.S. economy by primary metal manufacturing, which includes steel and gold and aluminum and everything else. Okay? But the value added by the downstream manufacturing sector that takes steel and makes it into something else is $990 billion, so 16 times higher. The employment is 16 times higher. Okay? So I see the effect of our anti-dumping duty procedures as significantly reducing economic welfare in the United States. My question is it time to consider change to the anti-dumping law such that duties would only be imposed if they would be shown to increase the economic welfare of the United States?
So I think first of all, there are two important things, right? So first of all, I completely understand and agree with what you're saying about, I can safely say words similar to these about the downstream impacts have been written on pieces of paper at the CEA in the last few years. We're well aware of how important downstream impacts are. At the same time, I think one of the things you've seen is we haven't done broad-based protection in the steel industry. We haven't blanketly said no steel imports. We haven't blanketly said big tariffs on all steel. What we've said is that global trade rules matter and that they need to be enforced. I think in steel and in a few other industries, you have a fairly, honestly, I think an unprecedented thing going on right now, which is you have literally half of the world's production in a country that is not operating on a market-based system in this industry. And that's different. And that leads to lots of cases where trade rules would say products are either being subsidized or they're being dumped. And I think that's what the trade rules are designed to deal with. I don't think that's the end game. And I think that's why you've seen the administration, along with some partners around the world, take very seriously the issue in steel that there's an overcapacity issue, primarily in China, that needs to be addressed in a global forum, because you don't want individual countries just putting up barriers that then raise input prices for downstream industries. You want to deal with the source issue, which is the fact that you have massive overcapacity in China, where supply was going up really quickly because demand was going up really quickly. Demand flattened out and supply kept going, and all of a sudden they were making a ton of steel that was being subsidized because it's all in state-owned enterprises that they're keeping afloat. And so that's not a viable way to run a large fixed cost industry around the world, where all the adjustment costs get forced on the other half of the world's production. And so you need to do something. But I think that doesn't mean that you necessarily scrap the trade rules. The trade rules are there for a reason, and I think they're being employed, in an entirely WTO consistent manner. They're being employed in a way that where we're not putting up trade barriers for no reason. We're literally just following the trade law. And I think we don't want to be raising the cost of steel in the United States relative to the rest of the world. We'd rather get the world production levels of steel such that they make sense and they're not being subsidized. And I think that's the direction we're trying to work. And anti-dumping and countervailing duties in some sense are supposed to be temporary issues to help relieve a problem, and I think that's the way they're being used right now.
Okay, we've got the students in the back of the room browsing, but we have a question right here first. He had his hand up earlier.
Hi, I'm Stephen Zell from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. So after 8 years, the question is, are there any additional tools, resources, or laws that you wish the U.S. government had at its disposal for the betterment of its trade policy, whether that's with regard to facilitating trade enforcement, or facilitating market access and market opening with more commercial diplomats, cities reform? I guess the question is, what tools do you wish you had, and perhaps transition to be able to make some decisions?
That's a great question, actually. I think we've tried to get more tools over the last couple of years. I think the Customs Bill was important to give the administration more tools. I actually think, and this is going to sound silly, and maybe it's what people in government often say, but I think a better funded system would be helpful in terms of the ability to enforce our trade rules, to make sure they're being enforced correctly. And I want to be clear here, I don't just mean on things like anti-dumping or countervailing duties, but there are times when you say, hey, this seems like a country is keeping U.S. exports out, that they're putting up market barriers, should we be doing something? And one of the concerns is, do we have the resources to adequately make the case to the WTO on that, and on this, and on this, and on this, and on this? And sometimes the answer from the agencies that are responsible is, we literally just don't have the number of people we would need to put against these issues, which seems silly given their massive scale and importance to the economy, that the shortage of a few people keeps you from putting together the kind of case you'd like at the WTO, but those are constraints. And so I think making sure that we can take actions to protect U.S. exporters, not just think about the trade rules that we can apply on imports, I think is something that would be really helpful, because I think it's something that would help shine a light where there are bad trade practices going on around the world, to make sure markets are as open as they've been negotiated to be, which I think is a really important part of trade enforcement.
In the back there.
Bill from Stewart. Really appreciate your understanding that the trade remedy laws are critical, trade enforcement is critical to rebuilding pro-trade confidence. One of the big issues is it's much broader than steel, is Chinese overcapacity writ large. From aluminum to virtually all the 28 sectors that are in the 5-year plan. Aluminum and steel are sort of the tip of the spear, if you will. We're going to have problems for years in any sector that they target as a sector they want to lead. How do we, as the administration, in terms of, as you lead that memo for your successor, what are your thoughts about how to deal with that Chinese phenomenon globally and systematically, whether it's in the G20, WTO, or alternative venues?
I think the shortest answer is you do everything you can in every venue you can, right? And so I think you've seen the G20 and the G7 talk about overcapacity. That's something they hadn't done before. I think you've seen China and the bilaterals make statements about they recognize this is a problem. I think part of what you have to do is just continue to make the intellectual case that this is not in China's interest or in anyone else's. That subsidizing inefficient industries at a loss to state-owned enterprises is not the way to run an economy, and that it has negative externalities to the rest of the world, especially in large fixed cost industries where there are going to be ebbs and flows in demand, and if you're forcing all the adjustment on the rest of the world, that's problematic. And so I think, I think it's just a continual process of China adjusting to the fact that it is one of the major players in the global economy and not a relatively small open economy that is a developing economy. And so I think that's a continual challenge. It's one I think the Chinese policymakers are grappling with, and policymakers in all sorts of international fora are starting to deal with that more and more. And so steel, I think you're right when you say steel is the tip of the spear on this, but it's also why we're trying to, in some sense, have it as a demonstration project of how do you deal with this. And you deal with this through a combination of using trade rules where they're appropriate and through international negotiations, both bilaterally and in multilateral fora.
Isn't the way to deal with this to carry a big stick and impose a 45% tariff on Chinese imports?
I think the way to deal with it, honestly, is to apply the trade rules you've got where they're appropriate. And I think, the argument you've seen made is that we've done too much of that in steel. I think the argument is that what you need to do is apply them where they're appropriate. That there's tons of fairly traded goods in the world, and you should let them be fairly traded. And if goods or services are being traded in a way counter to trade rules, then you use the trade remedies you have, not to try to act in a protectionist way, but to try to change behavior and to try to get back to the types of trade relationships that have been negotiated.
Okay. I've been told it's time for a last question, and we've got one in the back. He's been holding up his hand for a while now.
Hi, this is Karna, research fellow at Oxford. Brexit. And what's been so refreshing is we've been talking for an hour about trade, and no one's used that word.
I've been thinking it the whole time.
Whereas back in the UK, it is literally, it is in front of our faces. So if you can help me, just a bit of perspective from over here, what Brexit might mean for trade in Britain, in Europe, is there a consensus view? Does it matter? How do you look at it?
I think the shortest answer is I think the administration was relatively open about the fact that we were hoping Brexit didn't happen. I think the hard thing is talking about Brexit is we don't really have any idea what it means because what Brexit means to the global trading regime all depends on how Brexit is negotiated. But that said, it's still important to the global economy because I think the uncertainty over what it means is problematic. And I think you will see firms, and you are already seeing firms starting to change their supply chains and change their behavior because they don't know and they don't like uncertainty. And so I think coming to some sort of, mutually agreeable, sensible outcome that everyone understands what it is, the sooner the better. What does it mean? It means that, you've taken a trading relationship that was relatively uncomplicated and made it a lot more complicated. And I think we typically think that's not the way to go. And so that's where we see it.
Jay Shambaugh, thank you very much.
Thank you.